Hi to everyone. We're just going to leave it for a couple of minutes as people are admitted to the event, and then we'll kick off at 3 minutes past. Okay, I can see there's been a bit of a slowdown in people entering, so I think we're good to get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us at today's event. I'm Emma Jackson. I'm one of the editors at the Sociological Review, and I'm joining you from my office at Goldsmiths in New Cross in London. Please do say in the chat who you are and where you're based. It's nice to have a bit of a sense of who's in the room at an online event like this. This is the second seminar in our series that aims to take you behind the scenes of the Sociological Review and demystify the life of the review as an academic journal. Sometimes the processes of academic publishing are a bit shrouded in mystery, so we're trying to make that a bit more visible today. Our first event that some of you were at looked at the editorial roles within the journal. Today, we're focusing on writing journal articles, including how to know where to send them, what to do when you get your peer reviews back, and so on. Mulling on these subjects today are two guests who have both contributed recent and quite brilliant papers to the journal. So we have Dr. John Narayan. He is a lecturer in European and International Studies at King's College London. His most recent research is focused on the transnationalism of US and British Black Power and the political theory created by groups such as the Black Panther Party. He's currently working on the relationship between state racism and political economy. Our second guest is Dr. Siyu Chen. She's an assistant professor at Harbin Institute of Technology in Shenzhen in China. She mainly works in the fields of creative industries, youth culture, media studies, and gender studies. She employs qualitative methods, especially ethnographic fieldwork, with a particular focus on the Chinese context. The way this will work today is I have some questions, first of all, for John and Siyu that I will run through. But please do put your questions in the chat. I will try my best to weave some in where I can, but I will also take questions at the end for the two authors. So to get things started, can I ask you, John, to tell us a bit about your paper that was published in the Sociological Review, and also why you thought you would submit it to this particular journal?
Okay, thank you for that, Emma, and thanks for the Sociological Review for the invite from putting this on. I think it's going to be a really good resource, both today and going forward. So my paper is called British Black Power, and it's called the anti-imperialism of political blackness. And in a sense, what the paper tried to do is take a kind of debate that's happening in academia, which is really around anti-racist solidarity, a history which to that point wasn't really well known, which is British Black Power, but now is very well known, especially with Steve McQueen's kind of brilliant work in the last year or so, which has really brought that history to the fore, and try to kind of bring some historical research into that kind of political academic debate around anti-racist solidarity. And it simply just recovered elements of that history and tried to show, there's two main things that I do in my work. One is I try to show that theorization around anti-racism, anti-capitalism is actually better done normally outside of the academy by people who are actually in the struggle. And we in the academy sometimes don't fully grasp how that theory works. So the article kind of recovered that and tried to put it into kind of put that history of the 1960s and 1970s into more conversation with what was happening today. And I think I tweeted earlier, it's still the last bit is still the truest thing I ever wrote. Like it's so like, it's one of those things where I read it, I'm like, that's actually quite good. You know, like sometimes you read your own work and think, oh yeah, it's quite good. Who wrote that? You know, I do that all the time because I don't think my work's any good. And I was quite impressed with it. So that's kind of what the article's about. And then in terms of why I picked the Sociological Review, I guess for the ECRs in the room, I was transitioning out of a Leave a Hume Early Career Fellowship. I needed a job. So I think we should put some of the kind of real formal things into this.
Yeah.
And especially as, and I've seen in the room, some people have their pictures on, we have minority scholars as well. Sometimes when you're going through for jobs, you can be pigeonholed and be seen as not publishing in the right journals. And what I wanted to do, if you look at my publication track record, is I hit the so-called big one. But I picked journals where I think the debate and the kind of stuff that I do will really be, there'll be a receptive kind of audience there. And I think in British sociology, if we were really kind of like crunching, what are the big journals? There's of course sociology, and there are other journals, but the Sociological Review is a wonderful general journal, which then also has these wonderful, I think, kind of generosity to certain other debates, theoretical debates. I mean, if you're an STS scholar, you'll try to publish in the Sociological Review, but it also hosts lots of things. So one of the things for me was the kind of journal's generosity. And then I read back, and this is what maybe you should do, is read some of the issues back, see what the debates are. And I thought there was a bit of a niche for the article in the Sociological Review. And that was the main reason I sent it, actually, is I wanted to get, I think we can be blunt about this, I wanted to get a high-ranking journal article to look good on my CV, to transition to getting a job, at the same time publishing it in a place where I thought it would actually have a receptive audience. You'll probably take more about that in the questions.
Yeah, I think that those are two things we can come back to. I think it's really important. So one, where you want to enter a dialogue in, you know, which you're entering a conversation when you publish something in a journal, but also that element of pragmatism, which I don't think we should shy away from in this conversation either. I think that's really important. Thank you. And Siyu, same question to you. Can you tell us a bit about the paper and why you decided to submit it to the Sociological Review? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, so thank you, Emma, and thank you very much for the invitation. And it's my great honor to talk to you and John. And my article is entitled "Hoping Amidst Precarity." So this article focuses on a group of migrant work painters in a Chinese art village. They make their living by replicating classic masterpieces on the outer walls of the galleries. And that's why they're called wall painters. And they are faced with multiple dimensions of precarity in their everyday life due to their informal employment, unrecognized labor, unauthorized citizenship, and liminal workspaces. So why are these migrant workers attracted to the painting industry? And how do they live with such prolonged and multifaceted precarity? I look into these questions by conducting an ethnographic study, and based on my findings, I demonstrate that in China's post-industrial term, where the labor market has become increasingly volatile, these migrant workers chose to become wall painters in the hope of achieving a life of freedom, original work, and stability. However, this hope is utopian fantasy, as the multiple forms of precarity reinforce the conditions that threaten wall painters' careers. To cope with what is beyond their control, wall painters engage in 3 everyday practices of hope, and they are playing, creating, and waiting. And the shift of wall painters' hopes from a utopian to an everyday mode manifests the fluidity and contingency of their hopes. And by showing how differentiated distribution of hope is closely related to the uneven distribution of precarity, my study contributes to the political economy of hope in creative labor studies. So when it comes to the reason why I sent it to the Sociological Review, it's because when I was conceiving this article, I was greatly inspired by some works, particularly Anna Koopska's article, Keep Coping, Keep Going, and Julia Cook and Hernan Corvo's article, Agency, Futurity, and representation. And I really like the fact that Anna Koopska problematizes the link between creative workers' future orientation and their precarity. And I also find Cook and Corvo's uptake of the notion of the political economy of hope very illuminating. So both articles deal with futurity and hope, and both articles are published in the Sociological Review, and they speak to each other. So I want to engage myself in the ongoing discussion in precarity and hope. So I checked the website of the Sociological Review. I read the guideline and manifesto of the journal, and I decided that what I was about to write could be a good fit with the journal. So that's the main reason I decided to submit to the Sociological Review. And also, like John has said, because Sociological Review is such a prestigious journal, so that's why I want to have a try, because at least I can get very good, very helpful reviews to improve my articles.
Yeah, and we'll come back to what that process was actually like in a moment. Thank you for that. So once again, we've got this emphasis on dialogue in terms of who you're in conversation with. So sticking with you for a moment, Siyu, when in the process did you decide to publish with a Sociological Review? Was it at the outset or halfway through when you realised you were talking to this particular body of work, or at the end?
I would say at a very early stage, because actually I decided to submit to the Sociological Review before writing up the article. And I find making such a decision at a very early stage is a very beneficial step, because I read quite a few articles, especially the latest issues published in the Sociological Review, to learn the writing styles and what dialogues they speak to and how they engage with the theories. And by doing so, I got familiar with the journal, and it helped me to shape my article in the right direction.
Thank you, thank you. And John, what about you? When did you decide to send it to the Sociological Review?
Yeah, equally, I think as Siyu says, really quite early. I was a bit mercenary about it. You know, like I identified journals that I needed to publish in, and went after them, and luckily got in most of the ones I wanted to get into. So yeah, I really, for me, it was, I'm trying to remember, trying to put it all back in perspective. I had a job, but I still wanted to carry on my publication in these kind of journals so that I could get another job. And I did get the other job, because you see where I now work. And it was about, can I get into these high-ranking journals that are having these great discussions, because I feel like my work belongs there. And I think a lot of the times with early career researchers, sometimes there's a bit of a, you know, a kind of, can I go for that journal just yet? Do I have to build up? And, you know, I think you have a bit of ego. You think your work is good. And if you see that the fit's there, go for it. So it was quite early. I also have a joint article which came out last year in the Sociological Review. And in that process, we also quite early identified 2 journals that we wanted to target. And the Sociological Review is one of those. So I think it's always good to kind of go at the outset about where it is you may be writing for. So I wrote a different article for a different journal, and I knew I had to spin it a certain way for them to really be receptive to it. And that helps sometimes with the actual writing process, I think.
I think that's really good advice. And when you submit a journal article to the Sociological Review and lots of other places, actually, there is a space on the form that asks you why you submit into this particular journal. So it's good to have done your homework and to be able to say, oh, well, you know, this journal also draws on some ideas. This article draws on some ideas from these articles. It just shows that there's a fit there. So that's really useful advice. Thank you. So, second question is, what do you find most difficult about writing an academic journal article? And we'll start with Siyu this time.
I would say how to engage with the theories. Actually, that's the major concerns that the reviewers have raised in my article in the first round review. So based on the data collected in my field study, how to establish a dialogue between the theoretical and the empirical is something I find very challenging, probably because I'm a second language learner. So reading the theories is already very difficult for me. I mean, sometimes I'm not sure if I totally understand it or get it in the completely right way. And what's more, it requires not only using existing theories to interpret the case, but also use my particular case as an opportunity to further refine previous conceptualizations or theorizations. And I find the second part is actually particularly difficult for me. And somehow I feel that the different journals also place themselves differently in terms of the critical field. For example, I came from the background of area studies. So I used to submit to journals in China studies or Asian studies. And I had the tendency to take the local specificities of China for granted. And the analysis and theorization is mainly used to shed light for better understanding about China. But for journals like the Sociological Review, which reaches a much wider academic community and a more global audience, I was reminded by reviewers to highlight the local specificities of China and also use that as a starting case, a starting point to give a critical intervention to the existing theoretical discussion, which is largely based on evidences in the West. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think you pick up on a couple of things now, and in particular issues that relate to turning an ethnography into a journal article, which poses particular challenges as a fellow ethnographer. So it's interesting to hear you highlight that, and also that challenge of finding your own conceptual development to frame in the paper. Thank you. And John, what do you find most difficult about writing academic journal articles?
Well, I guess the obvious one is the 8,000 word limit, right? Which bugs everyone, especially if, you know, my writing style is not I don't think my writing style is the greatest. That's partly my education, so, you know, it has to go through multiple kind of redrafts to kind of cut the words down. If you're on my Twitter, you'll sometimes see me tweeting about that process, which I find really hard. And I guess also just the structure of a journal article, I guess just touch on something we're going to come to, but just like, you know, the way, you know, if you're writing a book or a book chapter, there are certain liberties you can do, certain ways the argument can be formed. Whereas in an article, I think sometimes it's a bit more structured. I mean, I like to start all of my articles with like a flowery interlude, right? But like you don't really have the time for that. And I like to build up. I always like to write. I'm quite lucky I've got away with it. I always like my conclusions to be really substantive. Some journals don't like that. I like to actually make most of my claims in the conclusion. And actually for the British Black Power essay, and we'll probably get to this a bit later about what you should do as you're sending out your article. In my network of people who, you know, I let them see the thing before it's sent out, you know, a number of times, specifically someone who's like a really informal mentor to me, who's a big professor, he basically said to me, like, John, you need to front load the introduction with the payoff. Like, you're waiting to the conclusion, like, and we need the introduction has to be the payoff. So it's that getting the, I would say, the form right of the journal article, which is different to other writing forms that you'll be doing, like books and book chapters and blog posts and things like that.
Yeah. So it's a genre, isn't it? It's a new and different genre, and I certainly recognise some of those struggles as both a writer and editor of front loading the payoff. So I think you've started to answer my next question, which was going to be about the difference in genre. Maybe Siyu, would you like to reflect on that at all, about the difference between writing an academic journal article and other forms of writing?
Okay, so actually I have never edited any book, and I have only written 2 invited book chapters. So very limited experience in other genre in terms of academic writing. But my impression is that journal articles usually stand alone as a body of work. And as John has just mentioned, it has a particular structure. But a book chapter needs to fit into the entire project and contribute to the overarching purpose of the book. So if it is an edited volume, it is very important to demonstrate its cohesiveness and coherence. So sometimes in the process of writing up the chapters, authors of the same edited volume will read each other's draft so that they can link their work with other chapters and speak to each other's case. And there might be some kind of cross-referencing between chapters, either by authors or editors, and so that each chapter doesn't need to say absolutely everything on the topic, and ideas can expand beyond the individual chapter. Another thing is that when writing for peer-reviewed journals, like John has said, there are usually very specific rules regarding what we might write about and how we might go about it. And it usually varies from one journal to another. So we need to do a thorough research about the journal and make sure that we meet all the requirements. And for book chapters, especially invited ones, my feeling is that we can afford more risks, and there's a little bit more room to be adventurous in the approach to the topic. And sometimes I feel that such variation is even preferred in some themed edited volume. So that's just my
I think that's true. There's much more room for the flowery vignette at the beginning in a book chapter.
Yes.
But I mean, I should say at Sociological Review, we do try and push in terms of writing styles, and not, we do welcome contributions that aren't too formulaic. But I would probably come back, as John talked about, that experience of going to a mentor and them saying, oh, put the payoff in the introduction, things like that. I think would probably stand for all journal articles, I would say. There's a couple of things that have been raised, and one of those is about getting a reader before you send it off. That's something that John spoke about. Is that something you always do, John?
So I guess we've got PhD students and ECRs in the room, and I think this is actually a really good tip. Some people's networks are much bigger at various points, but as you get older, I think your networks expand, and you'll have, your PhD supervisor, but you'll also have people you meet at, well, when we used to go to conferences, you meet at conferences and other things, and you will pick up mentors along the way. I just think this is what happens. Look, I will tell you, people email me stuff, and sometimes I don't really know them, but there's a kind of, I think there's a rites of passage. It was done for me, it was done for you. You will pick up that. And one of the things to do with your articles is to not feel that you're just writing it. It's a bit like the PhD process. You're not really just writing it alone, not just you. You're part of a community. And I think journal article writing and sending it to your networks is part of that engagement of an academic community. So I have a number of people who I'm very comfortable sending the work, and I'm very comfortable with what they'll say back to me, even if sometimes, I'll give you an example. The same person that said that thing about an article, I sent them actually one of my Leverhulme applications originally, and he went, "You're going to hate me, but I think this is really boring, even though it's really interesting," right? And because it came from him, I was like, oh, okay, so it must be true. It's a bit boring. And I rejigged it and look, I got the money. So, you know, always thanks to him for that. So I think that's something that you need to learn to do, is to draw on your networks and expertise, especially if they've published in that journal or they're publishing in the journals you want to publish. Normally the people in your networks that you've got as mentors will be a bit more down the track, and they can do what we're doing today. They can give you some of the tips. So that always send it out. Never just write it on your own and send it. That's my advice.
Thank you. And we will move on now to talk about your experience of receiving reviews. Sometimes it can be harder to take when feedback comes anonymously and not from somebody that you already trust and have a relationship with. So Siyu, can you tell us a bit about your experience of receiving peer review?
I've submitted my articles to different journals, and there was just one case where I got review that was very terse, or I would say more generic than I would like it to be. It's just one sentence. It's something like, you need to strengthen your argument, something like that. And I got resubmit, something like that. So, but most of the time I got very useful comments that led to significant improvements of my article. And the timeline varies a lot. In one case, it took me 1 year to get the first round of feedback. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of things there to pick up on. I mean, a one-line review isn't much use to anyone, I would say. How are you supposed to work with that? So there are many kinds of bad reviewing, but they sometimes get more airtime as well than the positive experiences of reviews, but they tend to be the ones that stick, don't they, the awful ones. But yeah, that sounds not very useful at all. But in terms of, and the timescale can also vary massively as well. But in terms of receiving your reviews for, say, the article you published in Sociological Review, did you find them easy to navigate or difficult, or?
Yeah, indeed, very, very inspiring and very easy to navigate, actually very detailed and engaged, super engaged. Actually, I was deeply impressed by the quality of the reviews. I have got altogether 4 reviewers' feedback in the very first round, and each has provided me with very engaging and highly constructive advice. And they were altogether 9 pages comments. And I remember, Emma, you sent me the feedback, and you wrote to me, you said, while the revisions required are major, please also hear the enthusiasm in these reviews. This is exactly what I felt. I did feel it was challenging. And to be honest, I was a little bit stressed out. But at the same time, I was very excited and touched by the fact that the colleagues put so much effort into helping me strengthen my argument. And that gave me a lot of drive to improve my article. And the feedback I got has made the revision a very enriching learning experience. And the review process is also very speedy. I got my first round feedback just 3 months after my first submission. And my second round feedback came back just 1 month after my second submission.
That's, yeah, it's good to know. Things have slowed down a little bit over the pandemic, I have to say. But sometimes articles do fly through. And I have my theories on why sometimes, but maybe that's for another session. I'm glad that was such a positive experience, and thanks for being honest about those major revisions, because it can be an awful feeling to get major revisions and pages, and you just wonder where to start with it, you know. But you'll only be asked to do those revisions if the reviewers and the editors think there is something there that you know can be developed, and the resulting paper is fantastic. John, can you tell us a bit about your experience of receiving reviews?
Yeah, and I would just link this back to the other point about getting a network, because what you're doing is you're preparing And I'm a father now, right? So it's a bit like, I get my son ready in the morning and I send him to school. But when he's at school, he's on his own, right? It's like, and I think that's like what your article is. You're sending it there and then you've got to make sure that it can survive. So I think that that's actually part of the process to actually having successful peer review, is making sure that it's prepared for that process as much as it can be before it gets there, right? And so, yeah, the reviews I got for my article for Sociological Review were really, really engaged. They sharpened the analysis. And I think one of the things you have to do is not take, and I think journals like the Sociological Review, you've got editors like Emma, they're not going to allow kind of nasty comments to get through, even if they were there. But most of the time is never take this personal. In a different place, for an edited collection I did with a very prominent scholar, the reviews we got for the initial proposal for that was so funny. They were so nasty, but one of them was so nasty, I wanted to frame it because it was so, and it was so, I find it really funny, right? It's not to take it personally and to try and see, especially if you're working with a journal that wants your piece, and you'll get this from the editor. If they're saying, look at the reviews, we're giving you these reviews because we want the article. And most of the times, if you're getting the re-rise and resubmit, they want the article, right? They want you to succeed. So you take the reviews, and what I normally do is I, just look at what the editor wants, what they want, and then you try and meet those kind of things as best you can. And I think maybe we'll talk about this. There are some things that you may yield on, and there are some things that you might dig your heels in over. But it's a part of give and take process. So when I got my reviews, they were really, really engaged with the article. And I've got to say, they made the article at least 25–30% better. So it's actually a really positive, when it goes really well, peer review is really good at actually making your work more sharp. That's been my experience of it. You shouldn't be scared of it. It's actually going to be good for you and good for your work.
Mm. That is really good to hear. We were talking a bit before the event opened about how, the horror stories are the ones that do the rounds a lot, and we all have a review or two story. The one. It's very good to hear that you laughed at it, John. I don't think I've evolved to that stage yet, but we all get them. And so, yeah, it's good to hear from both of you that was a more positive experience. And John, you started to answer this, but Siyu, how did you go about turning those 9 pages of comments back into something that you could respond to?
Well, actually, I didn't start revising right away. Actually, I put the feedback down for a couple of days just to give myself some time to step back and relax. And then I returned to the comments. And I read through them again and tried to identify each reviewer's higher order concerns and the overlaps between them. And I think such synthesis and incorporation of feedback was very important in my case. Just like John has mentioned, that one thing that is very challenging is to meet the requirement of the word limit. When I submitted my first manuscript, it was around 7,800 words. So that was very, very close to the word limit. So how to address each reviewer's concerns while keeping the word count under control is a challenge for me. So synthesizing the feedback helped me revise in a very focused and concise way. And I also made a revision plan. I listed all the action items and prioritized my top concerns and addressed why and how to make changes to my paper. It did not only provide me a roadmap to revision, but also became a basis on which I drafted my response to reviewers' comments point by point later on. And meanwhile, I also kept myself updated with the field and the related literature, because there were a lot of things going on in my field at that time. Before my first submission, the wall painters' workspaces were torn down. But in the process of revision, some wall painters found a good timing to reopen their wall studios when the government vowed to support microeconomy after the COVID-19 lockdown. So the change in the field speaks to Alakovska's latest study, which describes waiting as an everyday practice of hope. So I integrated the new case into my revision. And what I've learned in this process is that the field is constantly changing. And there are a lot of colleagues who keep doing brilliant work in the same field. So even after the initial manuscript is finished, the field study and the literature review should not stop there. And it could be a great help to the improvement of my work later on.
Thank you. A couple of really important points there. And the changing field one is really tough, isn't it? Because then there does have to come a point where you're like, okay, it's not going to change. You know, I have to send it off now again. But also the revision plan, I think, is a really great idea, because what that does as well is separate you from the reviews, you know, poring over the reviews again and again, especially if there's something in there that really annoys you or makes you feel sad, and then instead you've got your own action points rather than that you've taken from this set of reviews. So I think that's a really good plan. And John, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I would just say I do very similar thing. Extract the points that I need to do and put them in. I'm still old school. When I resubmit, I still write the old letter. We still, that, you know, like the, you know, when you've done your reviews, you normally write a letter back to the editors saying, like, I've done this, and this is the page where I've done this. So that I feel I'd link those two processes together, and yeah, the reviews I had were actually really quite nice. And in terms of the changing field, it's good to try and keep. There is a point where you go like, no more, but do have a scan, because you're going to submit. And CCR is quite quick, but not a lot of journals are that quick. I submitted one to another journal, which they didn't review for like at least 5 months because they said they were having difficulties. And then when I finally got it back to do the minor revisions, there had been stuff that had come out and I could put it in. But yeah, there does come a cutoff point where you have to say, you know, I wrote this article at this time and space, or anything else, it's done. But yeah, I think Siyu's covered most of the main things that I do as well, which is, I think, having a plan and just ticking it off, seeing it as a kind of exercise of editing, if almost not so much revisions, but editing. I think it always makes me feel better about it.
That's a nice spin on it. That's good. And I think as editor as well, I would add that letter is really important, where you say how you responded to the reviews, because if somebody is just glossing great big chunks of things that the reviewers thought were really important, you do notice that there might be an issue at that stage. So I think showing that you've thought, even if some of the things you haven't taken on board, that you haven't decided to make those changes, the fact that you have taken them on board and reflected on them is very useful for an editor. I'm going to open this up for questions from the floor, the virtual floor, in a sec. So, as you're thinking of the question you would like to ask, can I just ask you both, what would be your one top piece of advice for someone writing their first journal article? Siyu, you're unmuted already, so I'll ask you first.
I would say, if possible, it is better to decide on which journal to submit at an early stage, because then you will need to get familiar with the journal by reading articles published there. And the process itself is a good opportunity to learn how to formulate your article accordingly. So maybe for first timers, it could be like more easily to navigate the writing.
Thank you. Good top tip. And what about you, John?
Yeah, I would echo what you said. And I guess for many of the people in the room, you may be PhDs, ECRs, you're probably taking the material from a thesis. And it's just to remember that the scaffolding of one chapter doesn't necessarily lend itself to becoming an article, because it's supported by the other chapters. So it's a bit like what we were talking about earlier, how the journal article is its own genre. And you may not just be able to extract out one of the chapters of your PhD. It may be that you have to look at the form of what a journal article is and try and get that genre right. Because you'll have all of the material, it's just about putting it into that right structure. So that would be my kind of key advice, is to really look at how journal articles are put together, because it is slightly different to how you have been writing in your academic career thus far. You know, unless you're doing a PhD by publication, then you're ready to go. But that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think it is a real challenge. I think that going from a chapter length argument to a paper argument, which has to somehow, situate it in the bigger study, and yeah, it is very different. Thank you both for those great tips and sharing your experiences. Can I ask for questions from the floor? Okay, thanks for that virtual voice. Okay, great question from Matthias here in the chat. And somewhat, this is I do miss the old days of being in a room with someone, but isn't it great that you can pop in from Brazil? So welcome. And Matthias would like to ask you about your writing process. So once you've compiled enough notes, is it hard to get started? And the old question, how do you move from research to writing? So John, can I ask you to kick off on that one?
Yeah, I guess it also depends on what you do, right? Like what kind of sociologist. I don't even know what I am anymore. I'm a theoretician who does this historical work. I got this job based on my interdisciplinary scholar. But what happens is, for me, once I have my idea, the first thing I normally write for a journal article is the introduction. Because for me, it's almost like, and I've always written, even my university essays, once I had my introduction, some people write in different ways, I knew where I was going with the argument. Even in that little paragraph that tells the reader the structure of the essay, that really works for me in the writing process, because it consistently reminds me about what it is that I'm actually doing. So that's how I kind of move. And that's the first thing I normally write, is the introduction, normally with a flowery vignette that gets chopped out. I mean, Emma does something similar.
Same.
Yeah, and that will get chopped when I'm looking for the word counts. That will get moved out, and it will become a bit more generic. But that's where I start. How do I move from research to writing? I think at some point with the research stuff, and it depends. Again, this is all depends on what your research material is. But there has to come a point where you're just like, no, I'm just going to start writing, and then I'll edit more material in if I come across it. Because it's a bit like when you're writing your essays at university, there comes a point where you have to stop reading. And that for me is the key. So, and then normally I put some music on just to make this a bit more kind of, less swinging. I like to write to music. I put some music on and I write that way. And actually when I write the actual article, I might write different sections first. Even though I've run the introduction, I don't go linear. Sometimes I write, because I use subsections, I might write certain subsections first because that argument is more clearer at that moment in my mind. But I think you'll find your own groove is what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you, John. And Siyu, what about you?
Yeah, so I agree with John. I also started with the introduction because that's where we foreground our research question. And that will keep me on the right track and do not digress. And when it comes to how to turn my research into writing, because I do ethnographic study, but when I was in my field, I also take field notes and also read a lot, because every day I notice something that is worth noticing, and I will read something related to that, and I will take notes. And also in this process, gradually I will formulate some research questions. And I will get familiar with the conceptualizations and theorizations, and then start to go code. And after coding, and I will extract some like field incidents and start to structure, make an outline of my article. For example, which cases will be used in the article, something like that. And then after the outline is completed, I will start to write, like from the very beginning, the introduction.
Thank you. That was a great question. It's great to get the contrast as well between, someone who does more theoretically based research and someone who's dealing with field notes. Thanks for that. Someone is asking a question about the drifting away from the major argument. So how do you stop yourself drifting, your argument drifting, John?
Maybe I'm the wrong person for this. I tend to, so the way if you read anything I write, I use subsections a lot. And what I tend to do is at the end of my subsection is remind the reader of what it is that I'm trying to argue and what it is where I'm going, right? And this works really well in terms of structuring, then looking back at that section and saying, okay, does that really do this? Like, have I done that? Have I taken a detour? You know, it's the same when I'm teaching, actually. Sometimes I do detours and the students say, John, like, can we come back to, I like to head off on tangents. So one of the ways is to actually use the piece to structure your argument and the writing process. And so in an article as well, it is always good to remind, as you're writing, both your audience and yourself, what exactly is that section did and where you're going. And I think if you ingrain that into your writing process, when you then read back, you'll say, okay, did that section do that? But I would also say this: sometimes you do start the writing process and it does go somewhere different to maybe where you intended. And that's not always, I know this might be confusing advice, but that's not always a bad thing, if that makes sense. Sometimes the material does push it in a certain way. So I don't want to just turn it into a kind of robotic writing process for you guys. I think sometimes it does do that. But use that section sum up thing and really reflect on it, and you'll keep on arguing.
Thank you. I think using the structure to keep that discipline is really good advice, but then also realizing when it's not working and the material is taking you somewhere else. That is a fine balance, I think. And Siyu, what about you? Have you got any top tips on stopping the drift?
I think what I did is very similar to what John does, because I think it's always good to look back and see what you have done. And sometimes when I write something, and I will come back and then make a summary and see if this shortened version really corresponds to my research question. That's how I do.
That's a good idea as well, to center it around a research question and to use that. Thank you. And a question here about this business of turning a thesis, a dissertation into a journal article. Do you recommend finding a suitable journal first before you start turning it into a journal article? Yeah, is the question to see?
I think so. I think it's better to research the journal first, because then you will know first for some practical requirements, such as the word length and their file style, and this will speed up your process to turn your dissertation into something that the journal wants. And also, I think that for freshly baked PhD, how long the publication process typically take is also a very crucial question, because it's particularly important for early stage researchers to have something that is already published when they are on the labor market. So I think that maybe do some research on the journal first is a good idea. What do you think?
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the kind of pragmatic job-related questions, which I think will be on everyone's mind if you're coming out of a PhD, is you and your supervisory team should hopefully sit down and think about the publication process and how it's going to pan out, right? So now, and I'm not saying this is right, by the way, but now there is an expectation that some people publish during their PhD, that PhD students come onto the job market with 1 or 2 publications, and then a trajectory of where, maybe they can have a monograph that then comes out of the thesis. I think you need to really think about, so these are the kind of, I guess they're vulgar in a kind of, I am a kind of Marxist, but they're vulgar in a careerist sense, okay? You need to have them. You need to play the game correctly. So you'll identify the journals you want to publish in, where your material could go in, we've kind of talked about that, and how that's going to help you get the job that you want to get going forward. I think we have to be honest about that, don't we? Like that's partly why you initially start publishing. We also publish for this academic kind of commentary, but we also want to make a living. So can you, what are the big sub-journals in your field? What are the big generalist journals? Again, like I said, one of the things I wanted to do was publish also not only in sub-journals linked to my research, but directly around it, but also in the generalist journals that offer that space and will look really good on your CV because they have a high impact factor and they're prestigious. We have to be, we have to talk about that. So that's what I would do. And then in terms of the actual turning it into, like I said, just remember it's its own genre. The scaffolding that is in a thesis isn't there. And that's part of, learning to write articles is learning how to bring that scaffolding that maybe is 2 chapters in the PhD thesis and is actually just 2 paragraphs in the journal article.
It can feel so brutal, can't it? Because you form such an attachment to particular stories or particular people who feature in your work, and then to have to, strike them out because reviewer 3 thinks you need to, frame your argument more in the literature can feel so brutal. But I would say that is usually, taking out the examples in order to get the structure and the theoretical framing is really, really common. And there's also a question about how many years is your research too old still to be published? Yeah, that's an interesting one. Have either of you got thoughts on that one? From an editorial perspective, I would say it depends how you frame the work as well.
Well, I mean, the sociological reviews, do you remember Nassimia said this article on Du Bois was something like 16 years in the making? I swear I saw that, right? So, I mean, I'm also one of these people, when you write, I hope you've been doing this. Like, I'm one of those saddos who has like an other document, like, and you rip stuff out and you stick it there. A bit like, I mean, if Les Back was here, he would say that you always need a notebook, right? But lots of us are digital now. I have like files of, material that's just stuck there. And you never know actually when it's going to be useful. I ended up putting in some material for a journal article that I'd written maybe 5 years ago. And then you can make it more relevant if you need to update some of the material. But yeah, don't throw any of your research away. I don't think anything's too old ever, really, unless, as Emma says, when you then reframe it, it could be that it becomes more relevant and, academic fashions go around in circles. So what you think is old today might be cutting edge tomorrow. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you, John. Siyu, would you like to add to that at all about the, you spoke about that earlier, about that worry that the field is changing and your research aging?
Yeah, but I agree with John that I never throw away my research materials because I use Evernote, something like that, to label and tag my field notes and my article. I take some notes from the articles I read or books I read. So I put them together, and by using the software to organize them. So it's in a very orderly way. I never throw them away. So yeah.
Yeah, that's good to know, because it can feel when you're, jettisoning, something that you feel so attached to. It's good to know that that doesn't mean it's going in the bin. And thank you both for that. A question is, would you advise to say, okay, so should you save yourself a bit of space and write less than the word limit? With my editorial hat on, I would say that's very rare that people give themselves space. Was that something you would do, either of you?
No.
See you?
Actually, if you could do it, can I just say, if you can do that, all power to you, but I'm not sure it's possible.
See you?
Yeah, I'm quite into ethnographic details. I think that gives the blood and flesh of the writing. So I would like to have as much space as possible. Yeah.
I think it's normally people do, even if you would set out with that as an intention. I think as somebody who looks at a lot of the word counts on these journal articles, most times people are right up to it, like maybe one word up, before the word count, because every word counts. A question here. glad that you're enjoying the event. So here, if you've got good reviews, but you're informed that it contains multiple fields, how does one go about finding a journal that wouldn't accept an article with multiple fields? Anyone want to come in on that? I would say that sometimes, if that's the feedback you're getting, editors will probably give you a steer there. If they think it's not a good fit with the journal, if the reviews are good, but they think it's not a good fit, then usually I would hope they would give you some indication of where you should publish it. Either of you have any thoughts on that? Encountered something like this?
So I don't know. I think this is a question about interdisciplinarity, isn't it?
Yeah.
And finding. So my thing there would be to look for a journal that also does interdisciplinary work. The SOC Review does that. It does, doesn't it? They're not paying me either. That there are certain journals that will be more predisposed to your interdisciplinary. Like, so my article in the SOC Review is actually really an attempt to be an historian, right? And then it mixes with sociological theory. And there are certain places where I think that works. So I would have a look at the journals and see the kind of work they've published. And if they've published interdisciplinary work, you're best to go there, I think. And
Siyu, anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that I actually attempted to somehow enter the field of urban studies or other disciplines. And I do find it's a little bit difficult for me to find the suitable journals to submit to, because I'm most familiar with journals in China studies. So this worked for me once. I mean, I submitted journal to several China studies journals, but it got desk rejections several times. And there's no indication which journal should be suitable. And then I log on the website. I remember, if I remember correctly, it is called Master Journal, something like that. Then you can copy and paste your abstract there, and they will pop up a list of journals that could be possible venues for the publication. So actually, I chose the first one, and it worked that time. So I'm not sure if it is a very technical solution, but it worked that time.
Another less technical solution would be to just ask around as well in your academic community. But obviously that is easier, you know, when you've built that up as well. And that poses particular challenges for international scholars as well, you know, knowing where to publish. Thank you both for the generosity and your openness in talking about these things. It's been really fantastic. Can I just flag our next event, which is when you get to hear from the other side, the peer reviewers. We're going to have 2 members of our editorial board to talk about that work. And that's on the 28th of July at the same time, 12 o'clock. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks so much to John and Siyu for your insights. That's been really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.